used to be head of the CIA. If you got information that the National Security Advisor had not told the truth about contact with a Russian ambassador, how serious of an issue would that be if it were brought to you?
Well, I would certainly make sure that the president knew that that we had learned this. If we got that information in an intelligence report, then I would probably have sought a private meeting with the president to share that with him.
The concern was that the Russians would be able to blackmail the former National Security Advisor because of what they knew he had said something untrue and then caused the Vice President to say something untrue. Is that a plausible, possible outcome and something to be worried about?
You know, in all honesty, I think it's kind of a stretch. You know, it's one thing if somebody working for the U.S. government has sold secrets to the other side. It's another if they have something in their personal life that they're hiding for which they could be blackmailed. Having evidence that they didn't tell the truth to somebody in the same building where they work, maybe it's just the old intel guy, it's a problem. And it's a problem, like I just said, that I would tell the president about. But it's not the same as, and it's hard for me, I don't know General Flynn well, but it's hard for me to believe anybody would allow themselves to be blackmailed by the Russians because they didn't tell the full story or didn't tell the truth to the Vice President of the United States, who works 50 feet down the hall. You know, maybe he could have been blackmailed. It's theoretically possible. I just think it's a different kind of situation than we would have thought of in the intelligence business.
The president met with the Russian foreign minister and the ambassador in the Oval Office. There were pictures of them smiling in the Oval Office. What did you make of that meeting?
For a long time, Soviet foreign ministers would come in to see the president all the time, routinely. Jimmy Carter stopped that after the invasion of Afghanistan. Ronald Reagan resumed it in 1984, I think. And so the fact of a meeting like that, I think, is not that big a deal.
The Trump White House kept American photographers and press out of the room. The photographs were released by the Russians. What do you make of that?
I thought that was all pretty odd.
Pretty odd.
Yeah.
No. There's important business on the table with Russia all over the world. But there is also this, the intelligence community has a consensus that the Russians did meddle in the last election. So people look at smiling photographs in the Oval Office, and they look at this effort to meddle in the election, and they say, is there a disconnect there? Should there be sterner faces and a harsher approach to Russia?
Well, I think in the policies that have been followed since the president came into office, there really hasn't been any slack cut for the Russians. And I think one of the things that has surprised people has been that the relationship between the United States and Russia has in fact deteriorated since the election. The administration, the contrast between the way they have treated the Russians and the way they have reacted to the Chinese is pretty stark. So, you know, having smiles in the Oval Office, I don't know, maybe I'm just getting too old, but I don't think that's that big a deal. It's in their policies and in their actions that really matters, and in those arenas, I think they've been pretty tough-minded.
Some analysts look at Russia and say what Vladimir Putin really wanted by being involved in the U.S. election was just to throw the West into a kind of chaotic state, to undermine U.S. institutions. Do you think that Putin is getting what he wants?
Well, I think that he is certainly getting a lot of publicity for what the Russians are doing, and I'm not sure that's unwelcome to him. Look, I think this is a guy who saw the U.S. basically come out against him in his re-election campaign in 2012. He saw the U.S. being behind all of the color revolutions in Eastern Europe and in Georgia and Ukraine and so on. So his view is the West has been interfering in his politics for years. And I think that he has decided in a very strategic way to turn the tables and do everything in his power to, as we describe Russian elections as illegitimate, to try and communicate to the rest of the world that Western elections are illegitimate. And it's not just us. We know that now. It's Germany, it's France, it's a number of other countries, and it's a very broad and not very well disguised effort to create questions about the legitimacy of these Western elections. And I think, this is very KGB.
In North Korea, the president is relying very heavily on China. Is he relying too much on China so that it makes it hard for him to push back on China when it comes to the South China Sea or human rights or intellectual property rights?
I think that the disruptive nature, the tough talk on North Korea, the military deployments, sending the missile defense system to South Korea, I think these are all good things to have done. And I think he's gotten China's attention to a degree that his predecessors have not. That this is a very serious matter for the United States. My last visit to China as secretary, January 2011, I told President Hu, just like this, President of the United States wanted me to tell you that we now consider North Korea a direct threat to the United States. And it had no effect whatsoever. I think President Trump has their attention. And my one concern is that he may overestimate how much power China has in Pyongyang. They do have influence, and they do have companies, and they do have economic relationships that could make life much more difficult in the North. Their balancing act is how much worse can we make it in the North without creating that which scares us more than anything, which is a collapse in the North. And then what happens to all those nuclear weapons? So they're going to work very hard to avoid that. It's clear the relationship between China and North Korea has hardly ever been worse. Kim Jong-un has never been to Beijing in his leadership. President Xi has never been to North Korea. That's a first in that relationship. The Chinese press are saying some amazingly negative things about the North and about Kim Jong-un. So they are weighing in, and they are bringing greater pressure. Whether it will be enough, I think, remains to be seen.
A lot of people look at this president and think he is out of the bounds of the normal presidency. But your descriptions and assessment of the administration seems like you see him within the bounds of a normal presidency. Is that fair?
Again, I have tried to focus most of what I've talked about on the foreign policy side. That's the part I know. I didn't think this whole business with Director Comey was handled well. So there are sort of day-to-day aspects of the operation that I think are really troublesome. And I know that there are a lot of people in the country who have lots of issues with decisions that he's making on the domestic side. The thing that reassures me some on the foreign policy side is that he and his team seem to have worked out a relationship of trust, and a lot of the extraneous or extemporaneous things that were going on early on have largely settled out.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with more of our panel.
You're searching heaps of websites looking for the